The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners, at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Contained herein are the heresies of Radolf Buntwine, erstwhile monk turned traveling medical investigator. Join me as I study the secrets of the divine plagues and uncover the blasphemous truth that ours is not a loving God, and we are not its favored children. The heresies of Radolf Buntwine, wherever podcasts are available.
Hello and welcome to the Vulgar History Podcast. This is Season 1, Episode 1. My name is Anne Foster, and this is a feminist women's history comedy podcast where I'm just going to share some stories with you about women whose stories are not super well known, or even if you've heard of them, you might not know all the details about what they got up to exactly. It's a sort of history podcast where I just have these stories that I've run into, that I read about, that I feel like are really interesting, and that I just really want to share them with lots of people. And I've already shared them with all the people who I know in life. So I figured, why not start a podcast so even more people can learn all these bonkers, like scandalicious stories of all these amazing women. And when I was thinking about, making a little theme for my first season, what I fell upon, thanks to especially one of my Twitter mutuals, and I'm sorry I didn't write down what your name was, but one of my wonderful Twitter mutuals suggested well-behaved women seldom make history podcasts. So sort of inspired by the famous quote from Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who was a historian who was writing about Puritan burial rituals, like funerals in oldie Puritan times in America. And just casually in the middle of one of the paragraphs, this historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich just mentioned well-behaved women seldom make history. She was saying it in the middle of a bunch of other sentences. And she was basically saying, she's looking at these records and there's not a lot written about women because back in the day, and it's not super different now in a lot of places in the world, a woman was seen as being most successful if she just sort of stayed out of the limelight, stayed potentially inside the house, raising the children, not bringing any attention to herself. So what Laurel Thatcher Ulrich is saying by this quote, well-behaved women seldom make history, she's not saying so get out there and misbehave, women. She's just saying we don't know a lot about a lot of women from the last several centuries, millennium of patriarchal Western culture. And that's because the culture was designed to not know about them. So the women who we do know about are the women who didn't, quote unquote, behave themselves. And that's who we're going to be looking at this season. Just women who made a spectacle of themselves in various ways, who just sort of weren't just status quo. And we know about them because of how they were different from other people. And we're going to look at one of my most favorite women from history. And I've only just learned about her in the last year or so through a convoluted series of just, when you read about something and then that makes you read about something else, and then you're just in this deep rabbit hole and you start learning about all these amazing facts. The woman who we're looking at today, our first episode, is a woman named Caroline of Brunswick. And her story is especially, I think, resonant these days because there's been a lot of, we all are in our own sphere, so I'm not sure what information you're seeing in your various social media, but where I exist, sort of at the crossroads of British history and modern celebrity gossip, is the whole tabloid culture, and what that has to do with the British royal family has been under discussion, again, for various reasons I won't get into in this episode of this podcast. But the thing with Caroline of Brunswick is she was kind of the first real tabloid member of the royal family. And from then on, that's just kind of been part of what the British royal family's whole deal is. So I'll just explain the story. It's got twists. It's got turns. There's a cameo appearance by Jane Austen. And this is one of my favorite women from history currently who I know about. So her name was Caroline Amelia Elizabeth of Brunswick. She was born on May 17th, 1768. Her mother was Princess Augusta of Great Britain. So her mother was the sister of King George III of Britain. So Caroline was the niece of the British king. But her father was basically German, so she grew up in basically Germany. This was in the time period before Germany was called Germany, but basically she spoke German. She lived in a place that is now considered part of Germany. So her father was called the Duke of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. So her father was a duke, her mother was a princess, so she's basically royalty, sort of like minor royalty. She wasn't a princess, but her mother was. The thing is that her parents, Caroline's parents, Augusta and the Duke of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, did not get along with each other very well. They, in fact, seemed to quite dislike each other. So the Duke had a mistress whose name was Louise Hertford. And this was a sort of time and culture and class of people where, you just had your mistress and your mistress just hung out with you and you didn't really hide it. And that's kind of what was going on. Princess Augusta, Caroline's mother, was not a fan of that whole situation. And so Caroline just kind of got caught in the middle of this not great relationship between her parents. So she was sort of like, the father would be like, oh, your mother's so terrible. And the mother would be like, oh, your father's so terrible. Send him a message from me, send her a message from me. And she was just kind of stuck in the middle of all of that. So in terms of relationship role modeling, she didn't have the best role models to learn about what being a married couple was like. As I mentioned, she grew up in basically Germany. Her first language was German, but she was taught English, partially because her mother was British, but also because she was a minor royal and she was similar age to the British king's son, whose name was also George, and who was unmarried at this point. So basically, sort of like in a Cinderella scenario, every eligible young woman was being raised to be maybe the wife of the prince. And even though if you're got a mental family tree in your head, Caroline was the niece of the British king. The prince is the son of the British king. The two of them are first cousins, but that was not super weird at the time. It was a little weird, but at the same time, she lived in Germany. It's not like they grew up together. So we're going to get into other stories in other episodes. This could be a lot weirder, but it's basically sort of like a Targaryen Game of Thrones, sort of staying within your own family sort of situation. Anyway, so Caroline being raised to be maybe the wife when she grows up of her first cousin, Prince George. So they taught her English, and that's kind of One gets the sense that's sort of like the main thing that she was taught. Her parents weren't big into education in general of her. So she didn't get taught she just didn't get a lot of education. So she wasn't as book smart as other people might have been around her. She also was very much kept away from socializing, especially with boys and men. So sort of like a Rapunzel-ish situation where she's like literally kept in her room, not allowed to visit. Like she couldn't even know, like as a girl, she couldn't play with boys. As a young woman, she couldn't like dance with boys. The only servants she ever interacted with were female. But the thing is that sort of like Rapunzel in the movie Tangled, she's got like a really spirited sort of personality. And so even though she's being stuck in a room, she's like, that's not going to stop her. But also she's nothing like Rapunzel in Tangled because, as you'll find out, she's somewhat less wholesome than that. But basically, so she was allowed to go to balls sometimes. Like she begged and begged and they finally let her go to balls, but she wasn't allowed to dance. She had to sit and play cards with the older women. So it's just sort of like, of course she's going to rebel against this. Like she's got this like huge opinionated spirit. She's not being educated very much. She doesn't have an outlet for her energy. She's not allowed to dance or interact with men. So she just kind of builds up a whole lot of rebellion sort of personality type traits. So what happened is when she was a teenager, I want to say like around 15 years old, but don't quote me on that. But basically, her parents were at a ball. I feel like the ball might have been in her own house because they were able to get to her pretty quickly. But basically, she was tired of not being allowed to go to balls. And so she pretended that she was going into labor. Now, she was a young, unmarried teenager who had, as far as anyone knows, like never interacted with any male person other than her own father. So that was surprising. But she was like pretending she was in labor. She was like crying and screaming. I don't know how she knew what labor looked like, but she was apparently impersonating it very well. So her parents rushed to her side. They called a midwife. And then as soon as the midwife got there, Caroline basically stopped pretending to be in labor. And she was like, guess what? I'm not having a baby. I just want you to pay attention to me. I'm going to keep doing stuff like this if you don't let me go to the ball and dance. So like this is the sort of person we're dealing with. Like when she doesn't get what she wants, she might use unusual methods to get her point across. Unconventional, one might say. And I also that was a sort of detail where I was first reading a biography of Caroline of Brunswick, and I just thought like she pretended to be going into labor to make a point to her parents is sort of like, I just respect that a lot as like a teenage girl power move. Basically, what did she look like? Apparently, she was really cute. There's portraits of her, like contemporaneous portraits. She had a round face, curly blonde hair, and just sort of like generally sort of just a sweet, pretty looking sort of person. And then because of who her parents were, her mother being a princess, the sister of the British king, her father being this duke, she was an eligible young bachelorette. So her mother was busy trying to find like the right person for her to marry, but also like secretly hoping that maybe Caroline would marry her cousin, Prince George, which again was not as weird as it might be. It was still weird, basically. But in the meantime, Caroline, who like we know about her, she did this like fake giving birth scenario to get attention from her parents. Like they tried to trap her in her room, but she is clever. She's smart. She would go like horseback riding around the town, and apparently while she was doing that, she fell in love with a man who may or may not have been an Irish soldier. We're not sure. But basically her parents forbid her from marrying this guy, whoever he was, because of his quote unquote low status. Now, rumors, a lot of what we know about Caroline is like documented fact, but a lot of what has been documented are rumors written by people who, because of what she did later, were sort of slandering her and sort of making fun of her and sort of trying to paint her to be this crazy monster person. Basically, a rumor exists in some writing from around that time, not when she was a teenager, but from later, that she secretly gave birth to a baby. And the father was this Irish soldier, but my guess, I mean, she might have given birth to a baby. She might have, like, entirely plausible. But also I feel like the whole pretending to give birth is so weird and so unusual that somebody might have just sort of confused that whole story. Basically, for whatever reason, she did not get engaged until she was 26 years old in the year 1794. And I just want to give a little hot take, which is it's sort of a common perception that people in olden times got married when they were 12 or whatever. And a lot of times an engagement might happen or a betrothal when someone is really young. But the average age for women getting married in this time period was around 26. So she wasn't an old maid type person that she didn't get married till then. That's not weird. She was super eligible. Lots of people wanted to marry her and they just kind of tried to wait until they found the right person, and they did. And who did she get engaged to in 1794, age 26? Her first cousin, Prince George of Britain. So this was not a love match to begin with, in that Caroline and George had never met at this point. And also, I just need to side note, Prince George at this time was maybe the least popular member of the British royal family. And the British royal family itself was really unpopular. So he was kind of technically a catch, quote unquote, but let's get into it. So 1794. This is shortly after the American Revolution. So it was Prince George's father, King George III, he's the king from Hamilton, etc., who was the king when the Americans did the whole Hamilton thing. I'm not American, but the whole thing, Betsy Ross flag, etc. So basically, the British people were mad at the British royal family because they had lost this colony that was providing them with lots of goods and materials. And that was one reason why the British people were mad at the British royal family. But also the country was massively in debt, but the royal family was just kind of spending money was no issue at all. It's the sort of thing where when the economy is doing really badly, if the people in charge are just lavishly spending money on luxuries, that's going to make the everyday person a little bit mad at your royal family. And of the whole royal family, the person who was the most sort of shopaholic, just not paying attention to the mood of things, was Prince George, who was even considering this is the 18th century Britain royal family, the whole family spending too much money. Even he was spending so much money that even the rest of the royal family was whoa, he's spending too much money. So basically Parliament cut off his allowance, and they said, and this is exactly the beginning of sort of Cinderella / maybe a Regency era romance novel. And we are going to get into the Regency era in 10, 15 years from now. Basically, they said, you won't get your money back until you marry someone, ideally a princess. So Prince George was okay, well then I need to set up some sort of marriage of convenience so I can get my money, so I can get back to buying I don't even know, expensive shoes or whatever he was doing. So he had a mistress at this time. He had lots of mistresses. He was not a monogamous sort of guy. So his main mistress was named Frances Villiers, the Countess of Jersey, and she was pretty amazing herself. And so he was Frances, I need to choose a wife. And she's winding her fingers together, lightning strikes, mood lighting. She's just oh, I'll help you find a mistress. So basically, Frances Villiers is the mistress. She knows that she can never be the wife for various reasons. So she wanted to help him find a wife who would not take away too much of her power. She wanted to be how Caroline's father had the mistress who he took as his date to parties and stuff. Frances wanted to be the main number one mistress. So she sort of thought well, we need to find a wife for my lover who is sort of a pushover and sort of not well educated, and just somebody who will just sit around and have babies while I, Frances Villiers, can just live this amazing life. So she sort of snooped around, and she had lots of friends, and they were all good at gossip. And they told her, the word on the street was that Caroline of Brunswick was uneducated and sort of socially awkward, and seemed like she'd be sort of like a good, easy to control puppet type person. So she was like, George, I think you should marry your first cousin, Caroline of Brunswick. And he was like, great, because I want to get more money to buy curtains or whatever. And then also Parliament was like, this is great, because they wanted to make an alliance with Brunswick, which was where Caroline was from. And so everything's great. The king sent a man over to Brunswick to pick up Caroline, just make sure everything's okay, and like escort her back for the wedding. And the man who he sent over was called Lord Malmesbury. And this is where it gets even more sort of like the setup for a really amazing Regency romance novel. So Lord Malmesbury arrives in Brunswick and he finds Caroline. She's just like really cute, 26-year-old, little ringlet hair, full of life, just like really interesting, kind of weird, and also super sheltered and not super well educated. And as it turns out, she was in no condition to marry the heir to the throne of Great Britain. It's sort of like the beginning of the Princess Diaries, where it's just like, oh my God, she doesn't know which fork is which fork. Her hair is kind of frizzy. She like makes these sort of like weird, inappropriate jokes, like slash the beginning of My Fair Lady, basically. So Lord Malmesbury was like, okay, I'm not going to bring her back to England right now. I'm just going to stay here in Brunswick and like teach her table manners and like how to have good dinner conversation. So he was giving her princess lessons, but the thing is, Caroline was like, I don't really feel like learning this stuff. Like, I'm engaged to Prince George, so let's just get on with it. And eventually, like, her just weird, interesting charm was so much that Malmesbury was like, you know what? Like, I'm into this. Like, I think she's pretty great. And also she's clearly doesn't care about learning manners. And so I guess we're just going to head back to England. The two of them didn't fall in love, but like, let's get some fan fiction going, because I think that would be an interesting story. Basically, Malmesbury was like, well, this is the best we're going to get. So let's go back to England. So he accompanied her back to England, where she met Frances Villiers, who became one of her ladies in waiting, because of course she did. And then she went to meet Prince George. She said about him that he was nothing like as handsome as his portrait, which is like a total reverse Anne of Cleves scenario. And I love it. So she met him and she was like, ugh, this guy. And then he saw her and he was like, ugh, this person. I think she made some like off-color jokes or whatever, because Caroline just got a Caroline. And so basically it was like loathing at first sight. Like they both like, it's not just like, ooh, I don't know if I want to marry this person. They were both like, oh my God, like I literally hate this person. But they were royals and the engagement had been announced, and so they couldn't call it off. So Prince George basically just got drunk for 3 days. And they were married 3 days after they met. Their marriage was on April 8th, 1795. George was literally drunk throughout the ceremony. And this is where we get to one of our big plot twist moments, which is that he had been married before. So Prince George, before he met Frances, the like scheming lady in waiting / mistress, he had secretly and illegally married a woman named Maria Fitzherbert. And there was an episode of the podcast Noble Blood about this a bit ago. But basically, George had fallen in love with a woman named Maria Fitzherbert, who was a Catholic. They basically lived as like quote unquote man and wife for 8 years. They had some children together, but he hadn't gotten his father's permission to marry her, and she's Catholic, so it was not like officially recognized as a marriage, but they were like, they had had a marriage ceremony, so he was sort of married, but not really. Anyway, so he was drunk for the wedding. He hated her. She hated him, as well she should. He sounded awful. Basically, he was super drunk. He like tripped and fell on the ground, and she just like left him there. And that was their wedding night. Yet, but somehow, well, I mean, I guess we know how. 9 months later, Caroline gave birth to a baby, like 9 months after the wedding. So like these two people, sounds like, had sex once. Spoiler, ever. So she had a daughter who is named Charlotte, which was the name of her aunt/mother-in-law, the wife of the king. Anyway, so Princess Charlotte was born, and by then they had been married for 9 months. Prince George had come to just like profoundly hate Caroline even more than when he'd first met her. After the baby was born, he changed his will, and he said he wanted to leave everything to his wife, Maria Fitzherbert, the Catholic who he sort of was married to already, and left Caroline 1 shilling, which was just like making some sort of stupid point to his like postnatal wife. Anyway, she had a baby, he hated her, but remember how everybody in England hated the royal family, and especially Prince George? And so the tabloids were just sort of coming into being at this point. And so people from around the castle started like spilling secrets to them, saying like, guess what? So you know how Caroline just had this baby? Like it turns out that Prince George is like being really mean to her. The whole royal family kind of hates her. And the tabloids started publishing this. And so then the public started being like, oh my God, the royal family is being really mean to Caroline. And they all basically took her side, partially because she was amazing, but also more likely partially because they just hated the royal family. They saw her being mistreated by them, and then she became like a figurehead for their all sort of like nascent rebellion feelings. So like this got to a point where Caroline would take baby Charlotte out, like walking in like their little baby stroller, and people would like cheer for her. So she did this more and more often because it probably made her feel good, probably made the royal family feel annoyed. Like basically she was in this family that hated her, being isolated from literally everybody, but the public was there. They were on her side. And so, just like today, if you read Lainey gossip, the courtiers, the people who were hanging around the palace, just like kept spilling more and more secrets to the tabloids to try and make whoever they supported, the courtiers supported, look better or worse. So basically, Frances Villiers, her name started coming up in the story. So it was like a real life soap opera situation where people, just like the everyday people read the newspapers, or people who couldn't read, people would tell them about it. They're just like, oh my God, what did Caroline do? And then Frances did this, Prince George did this. And basically, the more the royal family treated Caroline badly, the more the people of Britain loved her. And then that made the royal family hate Caroline even more. But basically, these were 2 married people who like hated each other. And so they legally separated, which is like for late 18th century, like not a common thing to happen for the heir to the throne at all. But this is great. Caroline got to be free. She headed off to live in her own residence, like out of town. She wasn't in London. She got to live in the country. And she grew up trapped in this room, not allowed to dance. And then she got into this like toxic, awful family marriage relationship. And now she got to just like live her own beautiful life. And so again, this is where it's like, what did she do? What are rumors? Who's to say? It sounds like Caroline just like leaned into her freedom and started having the most amazing time. She flirted with like literally every man she met, perhaps had flings with the various men who she had over as house guests. She was just like throwing parties, having an amazing time. But she missed her daughter, Charlotte, who she'd had to leave. So Charlotte was off being raised by like governesses and nannies. Back with the royal family, they had a shared custody arrangement, but she didn't get to see her daughter as much as she wanted to, which is where Caroline, this takes another turn you might not expect, which is that she starts sort of collecting other people's babies. But so just stick with me for this. So basically, so Caroline made a friend, sort of a frenemy, in her little country home, whose name was Lady Douglas. And so she told Lady Douglas in 1802, she said that she was like, can I tell you a secret, Lady Douglas? And Lady Douglas is like, yeah, girl, yeah. And Caroline was like, I am secretly pregnant. Don't tell anybody. But she didn't look especially pregnant, as per Lady Douglas. And then shortly after that, this baby boy named William Austen came on the scene, who was 3 months old. It was sort of like unclear, had it been Caroline's baby she had 3 months ago, or did she just like adopt someone else's baby? But like, who is this baby and where did he come from? She adopted other children as well. Eventually, she had collected 9 orphan children, but William Austen was always her favorite. A few years later, Caroline and Lady Douglas they just, their friendship sort of crumpled into a horrible bonfire. So Lady Douglas, and this is all, again, like in the tabloids, like people were telling these secrets because like the people of Britain just like loved hearing about Caroline. So Lady Douglas said that Caroline had been like sending her mean letters. And then she also alleged that Caroline had committed infidelity on her husband and that William Austen was Caroline's son. The father was someone who's not her husband. So Caroline wrote a letter to the editor of the local newspaper. And she wrote it because the grammar is like not perfect. The writing style is kind of odd. Like she's got her own way of writing that's like, again, she was not like, her education was not like top tier, and also English is not her first language. So it's like, yeah, she wrote this. This is like her style. So basically the royal family was like, oh my God, how is she back in the tabloids? Did we not get rid of her? And so what they decided to do, which was kind of the worst possible idea if they wanted to like make this scandal go away, is they launched an official investigation into whether or not Caroline was the mother of baby William Austen. So this whole situation became known as the Delicate Investigation. And it was supposed to be secret, but obviously everybody was telling everything to the tabloids, and they kept doing that. So the commission who were investigating the Delicate Investigation, the Delicate investigators were all old white men. Like literally the prime minister was part of it, the Lord Chief Justice, like just men in their like, British judge wigs and whatever, just being like, let's just like investigate the sex life of this woman. Anyway, so they called Lady Douglas to testify. And just remember that Lady Douglas at this point hates Caroline, had been leaking stories to the press about Caroline. And basically this whole thing was her fault. And so she testified and she was like, Caroline is basically a nymphomaniac. She sleeps with literally every man, even the servants. She tried to seduce me. I think she's like she's an out of control nymphomaniac. But then Caroline's servants came to testify and they were all like, we didn't see anything weird. Also, she's our boss and she pays us well. And then, surprise final witness, like how to get away with murder moment, a woman named Sophia Austen appeared and she was like, hey, my name is Sophia Austen. William Austen is my son. It's not Caroline's son. Let's just all move on. And so they did, sort of. The Delicate Investigation ended with them finding that Caroline had not cheated on her husband. This was not her illegitimate baby, but she was forbidden to see Charlotte, her daughter, while the investigation was going on. And when the investigation ended, she was only allowed to see Charlotte once a week on supervised visits. And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that ShopPay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a co-founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. During her journey, Isla meets new friends, including King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, and learns valuable life lessons with every quest, sword fight, and dragon ride. Positive and uplifting stories remind us all about the importance of kindness, friendship, honesty, and positivity. Join me and an all-star cast of actors including Liam Neeson, Emily Blunt, Kristen Bell, Chris Hemsworth, among many others, in welcoming the Search for the Silver Lining podcast to the Go Kid Go network by listening today. Look for the Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who's ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
And we're back. And the supervisor of these visits was Caroline's mother. Flashback, remember, Princess Augusta, the sister of the king. So she was the chaperone. Basically, her mother had been terrible to her as a child. Now her mother was there supervising. Her mother basically also hated her. It was just like not a good scenario. But then, in 1811, everything changes substantially because the king, King George III, the one from Hamilton, he was declared basically permanently insane. So he had had mental health issues for quite a while, on and off, and just getting worse and worse. And that's a whole other discussion, like what was going on. There was a movie made about him called The Madness of King George. That was this guy. It's a good movie. Helen Mirren is in it, playing his wife. But basically, he was just like so ill he couldn't be the king anymore, but he was the king. But so what do you do when the king can't like do his king job is you bring out a regent, who's a person who will like do the day-to-day king type work. And so Prince George became the official regent, and thus began the Regency era. So this is just, you know, like empire waist dresses, like Pride and Prejudice, like the Regency era. So this is what's happening. But the thing with this, the regent, Prince George, is like, oh my God, I have so much more power now. And I have just been like obsessively hating my wife now for years. So he just started passing more rules to punish Caroline for just trying to live her life. So he stopped letting her visit with her daughter. And he started saying like anyone who's friends with her or goes to her parties is like not friends with me anymore. So all the friends started dumping Caroline to stay friends with Prince George. It was all just like just petty high school stuff. So Caroline was like, okay, sucks, but I'm sure there's a way that I can fight back for all of this. And she's clever. And so she tried to find, like, the tabloid press was still super supporting her. Like, she had the entire British population of like working people on her side, as well as all the newspapers and tabloids. But she needed something else to fight back against this because her husband was kind of the king at this point. So she found a guy named Henry Brougham, who was a politician that hated the royal family. So they began a campaign of anti-royal family propaganda. So just like sending stories to the tabloids, which they had been doing, but just like with this guy helping out. He's kind of like her PR expert. He was just better at planting better stories. So Prince George was mad about that. So then he leaked stuff to the tabloids to make Caroline look bad. And so anyway, it was just like all very much on the headlines everywhere. Everybody knew about it. Jane Austen was around because it's the Regency era and that was her time to shine. And she was entirely on Team Caroline in the whole scenario. She wrote, I think this was in her journals or something, or in a letter, she wrote about Caroline, quote, "Poor woman, I shall support her as long as I can because she is a woman and because I hate her husband." Like, if you're not sure whose side to be on in this story, like Jane Austen thinks Prince George is the worst, supports Caroline. So, you know, there's some information for you. The other notable literati of the time also had opinions on this. Like, for instance, Lord Byron was against Caroline, which again, if you're like, which side should I be on? It's like, well, Jane Austen's on Caroline's side. Lord Byron is on the prince's side. So just like, choose your fighter. So basically everything was just intense and crazy and like not great for her mental health. And finally, Caroline sorted out a way with her ally, the politician who was helping her out. She negotiated a deal with the foreign secretary where she got to move to Italy, and they would give her generous allowance if she just basically stayed away forever. And she was like, yeah, let's do this. So she purchased a villa on Lake Como, famously now the place where Amel and George Clooney live. So just like glamorous. She hired new servants to go help her out there, including a man named Bartolomeo Pargami. So she and Bartolomeo became very close, and everyone basically assumed they were lovers, even though they were both technically married to other people. And there's a certain philosophy in history that I just find simplifies things, where it's like, if you find people in history and it's like, it seems like they might have been sleeping together, like they probably were. So let's just like go ahead with that assumption. So this is all alleged, but like, I hope Caroline was sleeping with him because she deserves everything good. So she and her servants, including Bartolomeo, they basically lived in Lake Como and they went on these amazing, fabulous vacation adventures. Like they went on a Mediterranean cruise. They visited Malta and Constantinople and Nazareth. So remember, she grew up like trapped in a room, like literally trapped in a room. She had to play cards with old women instead of dancing. Like she was just like living her best life. There is a description of when she and Bartolomeo visited Jerusalem. She entered the city riding on a donkey among a convoy of camels, which is just like, do it, Caroline. Like, yes, just like you escaped your horrible husband, the British royal family, which were being the worst to you. And now you're just like living your life. I love it. But then, as per ever, she was being so amazing that people had to write about it. And then stories of her adventures got back to England. The people were like, oh my God, she's amazing, like #goals. And the British royal family was just like, ugh, her again. Why won't she go away? And Prince George was just at this point like fully obsessed with how much he hated her and wanted to destroy her. So while she was traveling around Europe, etc., her daughter Princess Charlotte had grown up in this period of time. And she got married to Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld in 1816. And then she died a year later in childbirth complications. So Charlotte, remember, she had grown up like she was in the stroller being pushed around and everybody cheered. Like she was like the people's princess, the like original people's princess. And so when she died, it became like like a national tragedy. Percy Shelley, the husband of Mary Shelley, published a pamphlet called An Address to the People on the Death of the Princess Charlotte, basically a tribute to her. Like everyone was so upset this 18-year-old princess had died. And now like also there was no heir to the throne, which complicated everything. And also everybody hated the British royal family. Like the only people that people liked were Caroline and Charlotte. And Caroline was in Italy. Charlotte was now dead. So basically Prince George is like, okay, he needs an heir. Like he's not the king, but he's basically acting as a king. He's the regent. And he needs to have a legitimate child to become king after him. So he's like, ugh, but I'm married to Caroline. Like, I'm never going to have sex with her ever again. I hate her like so viciously. So he's like, what I need to do is divorce her so I can marry someone else, so I can have a new baby who can be my heir. So he tried to get Parliament to agree to let him get a divorce. And they're like, you're not Henry VIII. # also, Henry VIII didn't actually get divorced. They're all just annulments. And also the government was so unpopular. Everybody loves Caroline. They're like, no, we're not going to let you divorce Caroline. So Caroline was just like, all right, you know what? I'm just going to come back to England, sort this shit out. She bid farewell to Bartolomeo, her maybe lover, and hopped on a boat back to England. When she arrived, literal riots broke out. Everyone was so excited to see her. She was like the main character in their telenovela there. For real, everybody freaked out about it. Also, the British people were just like hating the British royal family more and more and more and more, which made them love her more and more and more and more. So they're all just like really excited to have her back there. A bunch of members of the royal guard, like the soldiers, like they mutinied. Like they gave up being soldiers because they loved her so much. Like, anyway, Prince George was just like, how can I get rid of this goddamn woman? And he was like, well, there's rumors that she's been having an affair with a servant called Bartolomeo. So if she had adultery, then they could get a divorce. And so he's like, okay, I'm going to hold a public trial because, God, like, of course, what else can happen at this point? So witnesses from all across Europe and like the Mediterranean from Caroline and Bartolomeo's cruise came by, and they were all probably being paid by somebody or the other to say whatever. But some of them said they'd seen the two, Caroline and Bartolomeo, kissing. They'd seen them together, like semi-naked. But with every like new scandal, it just made the British people love Caroline even more. More than 800 petitions were circulated, with more than 1 million signatures from people who wanted the case against her to be dismissed. But Prince George would not stop trying to divorce her. So he was like, we need to find more witnesses, better witnesses. So he like sent people to Milan to try and basically pay off people to say like 100% we saw her sleeping with Bartolomeo. So the number of witnesses he was able to buy, / maybe they were real witnesses, like the whole thing just doesn't seem very legitimate to me. Anyway, things were not looking good for Caroline. So she was like considering maybe taking a deal, like a payoff to like maybe get a divorce, but she could only get a divorce if one of the other them admitted to adultery, and she's like, well, I'm not going to do that. But then everything changed. Ultimate plot twist. January 19th, 1820, the king died. And so Prince George now became King George IV, which meant, because they were still married, Caroline was now the queen. Sort of. Like, she wouldn't be officially the queen until she had a crown put on her head at the coronation. And so he was basically, at this point, it's just like, just looking for like loopholes. He's just like, well, if she doesn't come to coronation, then she'll never get a crown on her head, then she'll never be the queen. Like, he's just like, give up. Like, God, I hate this guy. So his coronation was planned, and he was like, what if we just don't invite Caroline? But she found out about it. Obviously, the date is publicly known. So it was being held at Westminster Abbey. So she just like showed up, crashed the coronation to presumably just like march down the aisle, grab a crown, put it on her head. So she tried to get in, but the like staff there stopped her. They're like, no, you're not on the guest list. So then she was like, guess what? There's more doors. So she ran around the building and tried another set of doors, which these doors didn't open. So then she ran around again and tried to enter through the main door, just like sliding in among the crowd, like, how do you do, fellow crowd? But she would not be deterred. They kicked her out again. She ran around again, and she found yet another door in the back. She snuck in, but then one of the new king, her husband's staff, somehow persuaded her to go back outside, which she did. And all this like running around Westminster Abbey just was like pretty undignified. It was like a step too far for the adoring public, and they're all just like, you know what? We don't love her anymore. So they jeered and booed her as she left in her carriage. And then she fell ill that night, sort of like, and again, I'm not American, but this happened to one of your presidents. I saw it on Drunk History. He gave a speech and it was raining, and then he got sick and died. So basically, she got sick. She got sick from being locked out of Westminster Abbey. And it was the early 1800s, so medicine was not amazing. Her condition got worse and worse and worse over the next 3 weeks. And it started to look like she was not going to get better. Caroline was like, got it. Like, I accept this. And so she burned all of her papers, letters, and memoirs, which is just like, ugh, if only those hadn't been burned, this would have been like some great writing, I bet. She wrote a new will and organized her own funeral arrangements. And this is just like, of course she did this. So she requested to be buried back in Brunswick, not in England, which had not been a great place for her. And she wanted to have the following inscription put on her tomb, quote, "Here lies Caroline, the injured Queen of England." So Caroline of Brunswick died on August 7th, 1821, aged 53. It seems like she died of some sort of cancer type situation, But rumors were flying around that she was maybe poisoned, which is like, I feel like not impossible given everything that's been going on in the story. So she had been kind of the queen, even though she was never coronated. So it was just like polite for her to get a funeral procession through the streets of London. But the whole thing, the people of England like loved her again. You know, they didn't like her for the running around the castle, but then she died. So now she's like people's princess again, people's queen. So the people planning her funeral were like, ugh, like we're pretty close to like rebellion/riots in London. So like having the like effigy of Queen Caroline go through the town would probably lead to more riots. So basically, usually the funeral procession goes like through London, but they're like, what if our funeral procession goes like around London to try and make it be not a riot? But of course that didn't work because everybody wanted to pay tribute to their fallen heroine the best way they knew how, like in her honor, to throw one final riot. So people threw stones and bricks at the soldiers who were in the procession. So the soldiers shot back into the crowd, and when that didn't work, they waved their sabers around while riding on their horses. Basically, it was chaos, and 2 people ended up dying, a carpenter named Richard Honey and a bricklayer named George Francis. So after everything simmered down, this is just an interesting side note, just sort of like the everyday people, they raised money in a kind of Regency-era Kickstarter to erect a tomb in memory of these 2 men, Richard Honey and George Francis, both of whom had died leaving children behind. So it just sort of showed like the spirit of like unity among the working classes. Like Caroline's supporters were like good people. So the riot happened and the funeral procession organizers were like, okay, let's just go through the city. Hopefully that will stop the riot. They did, and it did basically. And the route ended at the waterfront, and her body was placed on a ship to be sent back to Brunswick for her to be buried in Brunswick Cathedral. Her body is like sailing over to Brunswick Cathedral, and some English ministers are like in a different boat, like heading over to like just go check in the tomb to make sure everything's okay. And when they showed up, they found that the tomb had already been inscribed with, "Here lies Caroline, the injured Queen of England." And they were like, ooh, what if it doesn't say that? And the people in Brunswick were like, but we carved it, like we're the grave carvers, and this is what we did. So then a huge fight broke out between the Brunswick church people and the English ministers, which is just like her whole life. All it's been like, Caroline just like instigates such passion in people. Ultimately, the grave was changed, and so they put a boring Latin verse on it, like all queens get. But anyway, just like one last fuck you from Caroline to the royal family. So, sort of like Queen Anne from The Favourite, whose story was written by people who hated her. And so for a long time, we just kind of thought she was like useless and whatever. Caroline's story has not been reclaimed by people like me who love her until now. But the book that I read to get most of this information from was called Caroline and Charlotte, Lives of Caroline of Brunswick and Princess Charlotte of Wales by Alison Plowden from 1989. It's a good book for informational purposes, but it also leans a lot onto like, you get the sense Alison Plowden, the author, kind of believes a lot of the worst rumors about Caroline and thinks she's kind of like useless and stupid. There's one movie out about this, and there's a couple other books as well if you want to read more about Caroline, but I think the best way to honor her is just by like telling the story to other people. And as I just sort of like as a coda to the whole thing. So 16 years after Caroline died, and her husband, George IV, he didn't have any more legitimate children. So the throne went to his younger brother and then to his younger brother, and like none of these brothers had any children. And it's just like, oh my God, who's going to be the next king of England? Plot twist, not a king. So 16 years after Caroline died, another high-spirited, opinionated young German princess arrived in England to take on an important role. This was Princess Alexandrina Victoria of Kent, the only legitimate grandchild of King George III. She was crowned Queen Victoria in Westminster Abbey, the same place that years earlier her aunt, Caroline of Brunswick, had faced her final humiliation. Queen Victoria became known for her strict moral code, stubborn nature, devotion to her country and to the monarchy. Basically, Queen Victoria became one of history's most well-behaved women, while Caroline of Brunswick is remembered not much at all. Until now. So I think, inspired by some of my most favorite other podcasts, I would like to give each of the stories that I tell here a score. So I'm not scoring the person. I don't think anyone's life is more valuable or important than another person's life, but just like the story of it, like the whole thing of it. And so I have 4 different categories. The first of which is scandaliciousness. So this is like, of the whole situation, not just like how scandalous was this whole story, but like how scandalicious was it? Like the details of the scandal. So this is on a scale of, I guess, 0 to 10. And when we're looking at Caroline of Brunswick's story, we've got the like fake pretending to have a baby to get her parents' attention as a teenager. We've got the rumors that she might have had a baby as a teenager. She wanted to marry an Irish soldier, despite the fact that she was royal and then she wasn't allowed to do that. We've got the whole, she refused to be taught princess manners. But then like, oh, that's just sort of like interestingness, I guess. Like the scandaliciousness of it, like the liciousness comes in with the whole Bartolomeo situation. Well, actually, first, no. So when she goes to live in the country and she's rumored to have all of these, flirting with all these men, taking all these lovers, which like, I really hope she did. I hope she just like had lots of really great sex. So there's the rumor she had the lovers. Then there was like the William Austen situation where it's like, was that her baby? Was it not? The fact that that went to like a tribunal, like the prime minister was trying to decide like, did she have an extramarital affair? And then the Bartolomeo of it all, going off to Lake Como to live this just sort of like life of like Miss Fisher's murder mysteries, like just like deliciousness. Like there's a lot. And then coming back, like the riots, this is just like, there's a lot of scandaliciousness to this. On a scale of 0 to 10, I'm going to give her a 7. In that category, I think a firm 7. I mean, we're going to be looking at, over the course of this whole podcast series, lots of interesting women, lots of scandaliciousness, and I think for the first episode, this is like a strong start, a 7. The next category is scheminess. Like, how crafty was she? Well, not just like how smart was she, what were her sort of like plans, but like how schemy was she? Like, on a scale of like 0 to Cersei Lannister, like where is she in like secret backroom dealings and like secretly manipulating people and stuff? And so the thing with Caroline of Brunswick is that she did have some scheminess for sure. The whole like writing a letter to the editor, like leaking stories to the tabloid press, like hiring a PR advocate situation. Like in that respect, her scheminess was great. But in the respect of like, she didn't do a lot of like backroom dealing. She didn't do a lot of like jockeying for power against other people. Like she just wanted to live her own best life. She wasn't really out, seemingly, to me, I don't think, for like power or glory or anything. She just wanted to like have some fun. So she was schemy. I'd say she's medium schemy. I'm going to give her a 4 out of 10 for scheminess, because there's definitely some scheminess there. Like the tabloid involvement, the like going walking with her, the going for walks, the like really cultivating the British people's anti-monarchist feelings for her own ends. That was good. I'm going to bump her. I'm going to give her a 5 for scheminess. The next category is significance. And so this is like, again, no one person in the history of everything. Like everyone's life is everyone's life. But in terms of like, if we were looking at somebody, it's like, did she invent penicillin? Did she invade a country? Like, what are the long-term repercussions of the events of the story that we looked at? And so for Caroline Brunswick, regrettably, she was never crowned queen. Her daughter, Charlotte, died young, so there's not like a long lineage to look at. Like, Caroline of Brunswick did amazing things for herself. I think she really reached self-actualization in the course of her just like really interesting bonkers life. But in terms of like the long-term historical repercussions, like, okay, so if she and her husband had gotten along better, maybe they would have had more children. Maybe those children would have become the next monarchs of England. Maybe Queen Victoria would never have become queen. You know, like, there's some significance to what she did. The fact that she really, England got really close to a full revolution because of her, just sort of like everything she was up to. But it didn't have a revolution. Like, if there had been an actual like revolution, if like a French Revolution moment had happened with like the end of monarchy, that would be huge significance. But I'm going to give her a bit for significance. Like, her very existence in the world, everyone gets at least one. Everyone's significant in their own way. And the fact that she hated her husband so much that they never had any more children did have repercussions for the whole future of the British royal family. But overall, I'm just going to give her, I think, a 3 for significance. And then the final factor, this is a score out of 40. The final factor is what I'm just calling is sexism, basically. So like, how much was her life thwarted by patriarchy and by sexism and by people just like not just letting her live because she was a woman? You know, there's a number, we're going to be looking at so many cool people. Like, I can't wait to record these other episodes. But like, there's people who, because they were women, they were able to accomplish great things because they could get into certain spaces. Okay, that's pretty rare. It's usually people, like the people we're looking at, will be like, they accomplished great things despite the fact they were a woman. They accomplished great things and then they got burned as a witch because they were a woman. Like, sexism is such a huge part of all of this stuff. So like, in terms of significance, like if the British royal family had let women become heirs, like Augusta, Caroline's mother, was the older sister of George. So like, if it wasn't a son to son thing, Augusta could have been the queen and then Caroline would have been the next queen. Like, her life would have been totally different. And then the whole thing about like her husband was just like having affairs and mistresses and like it was no secret, illegitimate children. But then they were like, the fact that he was so just like, oh my God, did she have sex with another man? And that was like, I mean, basically every woman's story we're going to be looking at in this podcast. Sexism is always like, I can't think of a story where that's not going to be there. So we're giving her points. It's like making up points. It's like a bonus for like, how much sexism did she have to put up with, and yet she still led this interesting life. This is tricky on a scale of 0 to 10. It's definitely at least a 5. I think I'm going to stick with a 5 for sexism. So let me just do some quick math. It's 10, it's 20. Caroline Brunswick's score is a 20 out of 40 on the vulgar history scale. So that's the story. If you want to read more about her, like, again, the main book I used for research here is Caroline and Charlotte, Lives of Caroline of Brunswick and Princess Charlotte of Wales by Alison Plowden, which, again, it's like the information is good, but the book is just like really down on her. It's just like a newer biography might be better. And if you know of one, hey, let me know. You can email me at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com. I've also got like 7,000 million social media things to tell you about. But basically, my name is Anne Foster. This is the Vulgar History Podcast. I have a website at annefosterwriter.com. And I'm also on Twitter at AnneFosterWriter. I'm on patreon.com/AnneFosterWriter. And if you enjoy this episode of Vulgar History, like all the podcast hosts always say, you know, subscribe, rate, and review on your favorite podcast app. And I can't wait to tell you another story next time. And take care, everybody. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Anne Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Talmor, Sheshin Marachi. Talmor is my home. My family have worked the land for generations. My gran says the island does not belong to us, but we belong to the island. And we must be ready, for a great evil is coming, and death follows with it.
Listen and subscribe to the latest season of Undertow, The Harrowing, a Storyglass production presented by Realm, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Ah, the web tour. Those that both creators and were created by the threads disentangle from the fringes to feast on the very thing that spawned them.
What's that, City? This is how you deal with fear!
No! Do not harm my children! Oh, you lost a feather. Can I keep it?
No, you can't force me to!
Do you know what lies within nothing?
Rocket is in trouble, Akasa. Can we turn on the windshield remotely?
No, she could lose her job as an Akasar.
I don't fear Vehar.
No, but you fear me. If you intend to trick me, I will not hesitate to sever the oath bond entirely.
Why didn't you help me? Coward! I don't have a parachute! I don't like free falling!
Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.
I'm Brennan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys.
And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Subscribe to the Ghost Story Guys now on your favorite podcatcher to hear episodes like High Strangeness in Chicago, The Mystery of Missing Time, and The Haunting of Vietnam, along with dozens of others.
We've talked about mythical bridges, doppelgangers, haunted seaside towns, and so much more.
Remember that story about the guy who was trapped inside a dream and something was hunting him? That was upsetting.
Yes it was.
Want us to help ruin your sleep? Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.